Deep in the eastern Kentucky mountains, where fog drapes the hollows like a burial cloth and silence carries more weight than any scream, there once lived a family whose own blood had turned treacherous. This account follows Martha May Collier, a woman whose womb became a grave and whose infants entered existence already claimed by death. The time was 1947. Though World War II had concluded, the remote Appalachian valleys followed their own rhythm. The Collier clan had occupied the same hollow for 5 generations. They remained apart by both design and terrain. The nearest settlement, Harland, sat 23 miles distant over dangerous mountain passages that became unavoidable when winter settled in. The Colliers seldom ventured off their property. Necessity never demanded it. Everything they required could be found within their inherited boundaries, a stream providing water, planted ground yielding sustenance, and one another for human connection. Martha May entered the world in 1929, born to Ezekiel and Sarah Collier. She arrived last among 7 children, though merely 4 survived early childhood. Her formative years unfolded in isolation and repetition. The household spoke in their own tongue, an odd fusion of archaic English and invented terms that outsiders struggled to decipher. No school ever received them. No physician ever examined them. Their universe contained only the mountains and their kin. When Martha May reached 16 in 1945, her father arranged her marriage to her first cousin, Thomas Collier. Such unions carried no stigma in the hollow. The Colliers had married within the family for generations. Ezekiel himself had wed his uncle's daughter. His own father had taken a niece as wife. The family lineage had long abandoned outward expansion and instead had coiled inward, ancestral roots tangling with branches until the entire structure formed nothing but a knot of recycled names and shared substance. Thomas was 24, a silent man with a pronounced limp and eyes positioned excessively wide on his narrow face. He had entered existence with a cleft palate that rendered his speech nearly indecipherable. His hands shook perpetually, a condition that intensified with advancing years. Yet within the Collier household, these traits represented merely their hereditary inheritance, accepted as ordinary variations rather than harbingers of genetic deterioration. Martha May and Thomas occupied a cabin constructed by Thomas's grandfather, a dwelling that listed noticeably and admitted winter air through openings in its walls. The furnishings were handcrafted, rough yet serviceable. A solitary hearth supplied warmth and cooking capacity. They possessed no electrical service, no indoor plumbing, no contact with the exterior world beyond infrequent expeditions to exchange goods in town. Martha May conceived during the spring of 1946. She was 17. The pregnancy initially followed normal patterns, though she endured severe nausea and exhaustion that kept her bedridden for weeks. Sarah, her mother, attended her with remedies transmitted through countless generations, infusions prepared from roots, poultices spread across her distending abdomen, murmurs of prayer in the darkness. January 1947 brought Martha May's labor. Delivery consumed 36 hours. No physician attended, only Sarah and Thomas's mother, Rebecca, were present. When the infant finally emerged, the women stood mute. The baby, a boy they designated Ezekiel Jr., drew breath yet displayed profound malformations. His cranium was misshapen, stretched and compressed upon one side. His eyes protruded from their sockets, incapable of complete closure. His arms were contorted, bones bent in unnatural directions. His complexion bore a grayish cast, as though vitality had commenced its retreat. The newborn produced no cry. His respiration came in shallow, urgent gasps. His diminutive chest labored intensely. Martha May cradled him for 3 days, observing his gradual fading. He never nursed. He never vocalized. On the 4th day, his breathing ceased. They interred him behind the dwelling in earth so hardened they could scarcely penetrate it. Martha May's second conception occurred within months. She became pregnant again during summer 1947, and by spring 1948 delivered another infant. This child was female, named Sarah in honor of her grandmother. Little Sarah entered existence with more apparent difficulties. Her spine curved severely, forming a hump upon her back that rendered her frame distorted even in earliest life. One leg measured substantially shorter than its counterpart, concluding in a club foot. Her jaw projected forward, preventing complete mouth closure. Saliva perpetually escaped her lips. Yet unlike her brother, Sarah persisted. Her development proceeded slowly, never attaining the benchmarks that even the sequestered colliers recognized as ordinary. At 6 months, she remained unable to elevate her head. At 1 year, she exhibited no efforts to assume a seated position. Her eyes tracked movement, indicating some degree of consciousness, yet she never smiled, never produced the soft vocalizations of babyhood. She merely continued, inhaling and consuming, yet never genuinely living. The household attended her as capably as possible. Martha May devoted hours daily to feeding Sarah using cloth saturated with milk, as the child could not coordinate the motions needed for nursing. Thomas carved a specialized cradle conforming to her curved spine. They cherished her as individuals cherish something impaired that they feel obligated to safeguard. In 1949, Martha May conceived for the 3rd time. The sequence was establishing itself, though no family member possessed the awareness to comprehend what was unfolding. The infant delivered in early 1950 was another boy, designated Thomas Jr. He entered existence with a cranium excessively large for his frame, filled with fluid that caused the skull to expand grotesquely. His eyes were displaced toward the sides of his head by the pressure. His fontanelles, the soft regions on an infant's skull, never sealed. The skin stretched thin across his distended head, veins apparent beneath like a roadmap of agony. Thomas Jr. continued for 2 weeks. His breathing labored from the beginning, his system incapable of coordinating essential survival functions. He endured seizures that twisted his small body, his spine arching until it seemed ready to snap. Martha May clutched him throughout each episode, moisture streaming down her face, addressing a deity she had been taught cherished even the humblest of his beings. When Thomas Jr. perished, something fractured within Martha May. She was 21 years old and had interred 2 offspring while tending a third who would never advance beyond infancy. The other hollow women murmured that she bore a curse, that she transported mortality within her womb. Yet the reality was far more ordinary and considerably more alarming. The genetic inheritance she carried had predetermined this outcome before her own birth. Chapter 2: The Progression of Deterioration. By 1951, Martha May had delivered 6 children. 3 were deceased, placed in the modest burial ground behind the dwelling where timber crosses recorded their brief passages through existence. Sarah, now 3, had neither grown nor advanced. She stayed infant-sized, her body declining to mature, imprisoned in a condition of permanent dependency. 2 additional offspring had arrived during the intervening years, each bearing their own inventory of abnormalities. The 4th child, a son named Jacob, born late 1950, had continued past infancy yet exhibited his own horrifying constellation of difficulties. His eyes were obscured by cataracts from delivery, rendering him functionally sightless. His ears were malformed, diminutive and positioned excessively low on his skull, diminishing his hearing to muffled impressions of sound. Most disturbingly, his jaw had neglected proper formation, leaving him with an oral opening that could barely part, transforming nourishment into an agonizing procedure consuming hours. The 5th child, a daughter named Rebecca after Thomas's mother, arrived in 1951. She entered existence with her internal organs partially exposed through a defect in her abdominal wall. The skin had neglected complete closure during development, leaving a portion of her intestines uncovered. The midwives attempted to cover the aperture with fabric saturated in whiskey, hoping to bar infection, yet within days, the odor of decomposition filled the dwelling. Rebecca survived 11 days before her small frame succumbed to infection and systemic collapse. Martha May's physique was consuming itself. Each gestation exacted heavier tolls. Her teeth had commenced falling away, her gums shrinking and hemorrhaging. Her hair diminished and emerged in masses. Dark circles surrounded her eyes, which had acquired a vacant, haunted quality. She was 22, yet appeared 50. The mountain had aged her, or perhaps the children had, each claiming fragments of her youth, her vitality, her optimism. Thomas observed his wife's decline with helpless irritation that occasionally erupted as rage. He worked the fields from daybreak until darkness, attempting to supply adequate sustenance for their expanding household of impaired children. His own constitution was likewise deteriorating. The trembling in his hands had extended to his arms and legs. His gait had become increasingly labored. His speech, already challenging due to his cleft palate, grew nearly unintelligible as his facial muscles weakened. Other Hollow families began avoiding the colliers. When Martha May appeared in town for scarce supply expeditions, individuals looked away, invented reasons to cross the street. They observed her children, those who had persisted, and recognized something fundamentally wrong, though they lacked the learning to identify it. These were superstitious people, disposed to accept curses and divine retribution. They speculated what transgressions the colliers must have perpetrated to be burdened with such obvious evidence of wrongdoing. Yet the colliers were not being punished by any deity. They were being annihilated by arithmetic, by the dispassionate formulas of genetics that disregard affection or purpose. Every human transports recessive genes, mutations typically harmless when matched with a standard duplicate from the other parent. Yet when close relatives reproduce, the likelihood of two copies of these detrimental recessive genes combining multiplies dramatically. Within the Collier lineage, 5 generations of cousin unions had produced a genetic constriction. The same impaired genes circulated through the bloodline, manifesting and resurfacing with escalating frequency. With each generation, genetic variety diminished. With each interfamily marriage, the possibilities of ruinous combinations intensified. Martha May and Thomas were not merely first cousins. They were the product of generations of interfamily marriage. Their genetic resemblance was so substantial that their offspring received matched pairs of mutated genes affecting skeletal formation, neural tube development, connective tissue integrity, and innumerable other biological systems. During winter 1952, Martha May conceived for the 7th time. She was 23. By this period, she had abandoned hope for a healthy infant. She merely persisted, navigating her days in a haze of fatigue and surrender. Thomas had ceased touching her with any tenderness. Their coupling had transformed into a grim responsibility performed in silence and darkness. The pregnancy proved difficult from commencement. Martha May experienced hemorrhaging throughout the first trimester. Her abdomen expanded disproportionately, and she could detect unusual movements within. Not the typical kicks and rotations of a developing fetus, but irregular impacts and shifts that felt aberrant. Sarah, the family matriarch, prepared remedies and uttered prayers, yet even she appeared to have abandoned faith in their efficacy. August 1952 brought Martha May into premature labor. The delivery was rapid and violent. The infant, another son, emerged stillborn. His body was coated in dense, dark hair from crown to sole, a condition designated hypertrichosis that bestowed an almost bestial appearance. His spine was exposed along his back, the vertebrae visible through an opening in the skin. His internal organs had neglected proper development. An autopsy, had one been conducted, would have revealed kidneys that were conjoined and lungs that had never completely formed. They buried him that same day, adding another timber cross to the expanding burial ground. Martha May did not attend the interment. She lay in bed, regarding the ceiling, her frame depleted and her consciousness numbed. She had commenced comprehending, in some primal manner transcending instruction or formal learning, that her womb had transformed into a location where life traveled to expire. Chapter 3: The Concealment Within the Hollow. The year 1953 delivered no respite to the Collier household. Martha May, now 24, was again pregnant. This would represent her 8th child. Sarah, now 5, remained developmentally arrested at an infant stage, demanding constant attention. Jacob, at 3, had mastered navigation of his blind and silent world through tactile sensation. Yet his jaw condition restricted him to liquids and softened foods painstakingly prepared by his mother. The newest addition to this assemblage of affliction was born March 1953, a son they designated Daniel. He arrived with a condition causing him to appear partially liquefied. His facial features were asymmetrical to an extraordinary degree, one side drooping substantially beneath the other. His cranial bones had neglected proper fusion, leaving soft regions that pulsed visibly with his heartbeat. Most alarming was his respiration, a damp, gurgling sound indicating fluid within his lungs that his body could not eliminate. Daniel survived 6 months. Throughout that interval, Martha May barely rested, constantly monitoring his breathing, clearing his airway, attempting to maintain his existence through determined resolve. When he finally perished in September, she experienced a guilty sensation of relief intermingled with her sorrow. She was depleted beyond measure, operating on instinct alone, attending 3 severely impaired children while her body prepared to create another. The community's response to the Collier circumstance was complex and contradictory. Christian compassion mandated some degree of assistance. Congregation members occasionally deposited food or garments, leaving items upon the porch without knocking, avoiding personal encounter. Simultaneously, the visible evidence of the Collier situation generated fear and aversion. Individuals spoke in hushed tones regarding what transpired when families became excessively close, when the bloodline curved inward. An elderly woman designated Mrs. Hester, who operated the general establishment in Harland, eventually initiated action. During autumn 1953, she contacted a traveling physician named Coleman, who visited remote communities several times annually. She described the Collier circumstance in terms that finally penetrated his professional detachment. He consented to visit their hollow. Dr. Coleman arrived at the Collier cabin November 1953. He was 56, a man who had witnessed poverty, abandonment, and suffering throughout his Appalachian career. Yet nothing had prepared him for what he encountered within that dwelling. Sarah, now 5.5, lay in a cradle constructed for an infant, her frame contorted and underdeveloped, her eyes tracking him with an awareness that caused his flesh to crawl. Jacob, blind and deaf, oscillated in a corner, his malformed jaw bestowing his face a grotesque quality. Another child, a daughter born earlier that year, sat propped against a wall, her head inclined sideways, saliva accumulating on her garment. Martha May herself appeared near expiration. At 24, she resembled 50. Her complexion bore a grayish cast. Her hair hung in sparse, oily strands. Her eyes were recessed and vacant. She was 7 months pregnant with her 9th child. Dr. Coleman examined each child, documenting his observations with mounting horror. The pattern was unmistakable. These represented not random birth anomalies or misfortune. This was the systematic genetic deterioration of a lineage that had interbred excessively. He had encountered such cases in medical journals, theoretical discussions of isolated communities and genetic drift. Yet witnessing it personally, within this dim cabin permeated with illness and hopelessness, proved entirely distinct. He sat with Thomas and Martha May and endeavored to explain. He employed straightforward terminology, avoiding medical vocabulary. "Your blood is excessively similar," he informed them. "When cousins produce children, occasionally detrimental characteristics transfer from both sides. It resembles mixing identical paint repeatedly. It becomes increasingly murky each time." Thomas regarded him without comprehension. Martha May simply inclined her head, too depleted to absorb information that might have redirected their trajectory years previously. Dr. Coleman advanced a recommendation that astonished them. No additional children. He elaborated regarding prevention, regarding intervals, regarding the necessity of terminating this sequence. Yet his counsel fell upon unreceptive ears. The Colliers possessed no framework for family limitation. Their faith, such as it was, regarded children as divine gifts, not matters of selection. And more fundamentally, they lacked the capacity to conceive an alternative existence. Before departing, Dr. Coleman performed an unusual act. He composed a comprehensive account of his observations and forwarded it to the State Health Department in Frankfurt. He incorporated descriptions of each child, approximations of their life expectancies, and a robust recommendation for intervention. The report disappeared into administrative channels and generated no immediate response. Martha May delivered her 9th child January 1954, a daughter they designated Martha Jr. She entered existence with a condition termed microcephaly. Her cranium was dramatically reduced relative to standard dimensions, indicating severe cerebral underdevelopment. Her skull was misshapen, pointed at the summit. Her eyes were broadly set and unfocused. She produced no sounds except a sustained, elevated whine that persisted almost constantly. She would never articulate, never ambulate, never acknowledge her own mother. By this juncture, Martha May had ceased designating her children with any optimism connected to those designations. They were merely identifiers for bodies that would either perish or continue in conditions resembling death. She navigated her days mechanically, nourishing and cleansing children who could not express gratitude, interring others who could not object. At the most strategic moment, when the burden of Martha May's anguish seems unendurable, I invite you to undertake something. Within the comments beneath, inscribe these words, "I see you, Martha May." Communicate to her across the decades that her suffering is acknowledged, that she remains unforgotten. Chapter 4, The Inquiry. Spring 1954. Dr. Coleman's report ultimately reached someone possessing sufficient concern to respond. Dr. Helen Pritchard, a researcher at the University of Kentucky investigating hereditary conditions within isolated communities, perused Coleman's account with escalating fascination and horror. She recognized within the Collier family a case study capable of illuminating the perils of interbreeding, supplying data for genetic investigation, and perhaps, if intervention arrived with sufficient urgency, preventing additional catastrophe. Dr. Pritchard was 42, a woman who had struggled through medical education during an era when female physicians were uncommon and frequently disregarded. She had cultivated resilience and determination to pursue truth irrespective of social discomfort. She petitioned authorization to visit the Collier family and execute comprehensive investigation. She arrived at the Hollow June 1954 accompanied by a younger associate, Dr. Robert Chun, specializing in pediatric medicine. They transported medical apparatus, photographic equipment, and recording devices to document their observations. The Colliers, unaccustomed to visitors and particularly unaccustomed to professional individuals displaying interest in their circumstance, were initially wary. Yet Martha May, now 25 and visibly deteriorating, consented to permit examination of the children. What Dr. Pritchard and Dr. Chun documented across the subsequent 3 days evolved into one of the most exhaustive investigations of inbreeding depression in humans ever performed. They examined 6 living offspring ranging from 7 years to 6 months. They photographed the children from multiple perspectives, recording every apparent anomaly. They measured cranial circumferences, limb dimensions, and developmental indicators. They interviewed Martha May and Thomas regarding family history, gradually reconstructing the genealogy that had produced this catastrophe. The family lineage they constructed was devastating in its straightforwardness. The Colliers had intermarried since at least 1847, when the initial generation established themselves in the Hollow. Great-grandfather had wed great-aunt. Grandfather had wed his first cousin. Father had wed his uncle's daughter. The identical names emerged repeatedly. The genetic reservoir diminishing with each generation until it became a puddle rather than a pool. Dr. Pritchard calculated that Martha May and Thomas shared approximately 37.5% of their DNA, substantially exceeding the 12.5% characteristic of first cousins due to accumulated intermarriage in preceding generations. This signified that their offspring experienced tremendously elevated probability of inheriting 2 copies of any detrimental recessive gene present within the family line. The physicians identified at minimum 12 distinct genetic disorders present within the Collier children. Certain conditions were familiar: cleft palate, club foot, microcephaly. Others represented uncommon syndromes, typically encountered solely within isolated communities or consanguineous unions. Several children exhibited combinations of conditions suggesting multiple genetic mutations operating simultaneously. Most heartbreaking was the physician's prognosis for the surviving children. Sarah, at 7, possessed the physical and mental development of a 3-month-old infant. She would never ambulate, articulate, or exist independently. Jacob's blindness and deafness combined with his jaw deformity signified he would demand complete care throughout life. The younger children demonstrated even more severe impairments. Dr. Chun estimated that none of the children would survive beyond age 15, and most would expire considerably younger. Dr. Pritchard sat with Martha May on the 3rd day of their visit. She endeavored to articulate in clear language what had transpired. "Your children are perishing because of the family marriages," she expressed gently. "When relatives produce children together, detrimental genes become duplicated. Your infants are delivered with conditions that cannot be remedied." Martha May listened with an expression difficult to interpret. Exhaustion. Resignation. Ultimately, she spoke, her voice scarcely exceeding a whisper. "I understand. I have understood since Sarah. I can perceive it when they're developing within me. Something is wrong from the commencement. Yet what am I supposed to do? This represents my family. This represents my husband. I cannot simply depart. And there resided the core of the tragedy. Martha May was imprisoned by geography, by tradition, by poverty, by faith, by affection, by obligation. She could no more choose departure than she could choose to cease respiration. The hollow constituted her entire universe, and the conventions of that universe had been established long before her emergence. Dr. Pritchard advanced a recommendation to state authorities. The Collier children should be extracted from the residence and positioned within specialized care facilities. Martha May should receive medical intervention to avert future pregnancies. Thomas should obtain counseling regarding the genetic hazards of their circumstance. The family should be relocated, if feasible, to a community with greater diversity and diminished isolation. None of these recommendations were implemented. The state lacked both resources and political determination to intervene in a remote family's private affairs. The Colliers had perpetrated no offense. They were impoverished and isolated, yet not actively neglectful. Their circumstance was tragic yet not unlawful. Extracting children from parents required evidence of abuse or imminent danger. And while the children's conditions were severe, they were being nourished and sheltered to the optimal extent of the family's capability. Dr. Pritchard departed the Hollow late June 1954, transporting boxes of documentation, photographs, and measurements. She published her findings in the Journal of Medical Genetics early 1955, employing pseudonyms to safeguard the family's identity. The article, designated Genetic Consequences of Extended Consanguinity in an Isolated Mountain Population, evolved into a foundational study referenced for decades by researchers examining the effects of inbreeding. Yet for Martha May, the investigation altered nothing. She was pregnant again by autumn 1954, her 10th child. Chapter 5, The Ultimate Chapter. Martha May Collier's 10th child was delivered May 1955, another son designated Ezekiel III, after the grandfather and the initial deceased son. He arrived with a condition that rendered Dr. Pritchard's documentation prophetic. His bones were so fragile that the delivery process alone produced multiple fractures. His ribs were discernible through his translucent skin, bent at angles indicating they had fractured and healed improperly while still within the womb. His skull was soft, collapsing slightly under even gentle pressure. Ezekiel III survived 18 days. Throughout that interval, Martha May clutched him almost continuously, apprehensive that positioning him down would inflict additional injury upon his fragile frame. She fed him milk droplets using an eyedropper, monitored his shallow respiration, and anticipated the inevitable conclusion. When it arrived, she experienced numbness rather than grief. She had exhausted tears years previously. The child's death precipitated a crisis within Martha May herself. At 26, her body had been pregnant or recuperating from pregnancy for nearly 10 consecutive years. She had carried 10 children, interred 5, and was attending 5 severely impaired offspring who would never mature, never depart the residence, never experience ordinary existence. The physical toll was catastrophic. Her bones had weakened from repeated pregnancies and inadequate nutrition. Her teeth were nearly absent, rendering consumption painful. Her uterus had commenced prolapsing, producing continuous discomfort and hemorrhaging. August 1955, Martha May collapsed while laboring in the garden. Thomas discovered her reclining in the soil, conscious yet incapable of rising. He transported her inside and transmitted communication to Mrs. Hester at the general establishment, who contacted Dr. Coleman. The physician arrived 2 days subsequently, examined Martha May, and delivered an unsparing assessment. Her body was surrendering. Years of malnutrition, repeated pregnancies, and the stress of attending severely impaired children had propelled her beyond her limits. Dr. Coleman insisted she be transported to the hospital in Lexington, exceeding 100 miles distant. Thomas initially resisted, the expense, the distance, the disruption to the household. Yet the physician was unyielding. If she remains here, she will be deceased within a month, he stated bluntly. Martha May spent 6 weeks hospitalized. Physicians there treated her for severe anemia, malnutrition, infections, and the physical damage from repeated childbirth. They also implemented measures to ensure she would not become pregnant again, executing a procedure without fully explaining it to Martha May or seeking explicit consent, a decision reflecting both the paternalism of the period and genuine concern for her survival. When Martha May returned to the Hollow October 1955, she discovered that one of her children had perished during her absence. Martha Jr., born with microcephaly 16 months earlier, had succumbed to pneumonia. She was interred adjacent to her siblings within the expanding burial ground. Martha May stood at the gravesite and experienced nothing. The capacity for sorrow had been consumed. The years that followed delivered gradual decline rather than dramatic occurrences. Sarah perished in 1958 at age 10, her body ultimately surrendering after a decade of marginal function. Jacob survived until 1961, expiring at age 11 from complications associated with his multiple conditions. The other children followed successively, none attaining age 13. Each death represented both tragedy and relief, release from suffering for the children, reduction in the overwhelming burden of care for Martha May. By 1965, all of Martha May's children were deceased. 10 pregnancies had produced 10 children, and all 10 had either perished in infancy or childhood. The timber crosses behind the dwelling marked the entirety of her reproductive existence, a decade of gestation and loss that had consumed her youth and destroyed her health. Thomas perished in 1967 at age 46. His body exhausted by years of physical labor and genetic conditions that had been gradually intensifying throughout his life. Martha May continued alone in the Hollow for another 12 years. She never remarried, never departed the mountain. Neighbors periodically checked upon her, leaving provisions upon the porch. She was observed infrequently, a specter haunting the location where her life had unfolded and concluded while she still breathed. Dr. Helen Pritchard continued her investigation of isolated communities and genetic diseases. She frequently contemplated Martha May Collier, the woman whose body had transformed into a laboratory demonstrating the cruelest arithmetic of human genetics. In 1972, she published a subsequent article tracking the outcomes of all 10 Collier children, supplying empirical evidence of the devastating effects of sustained inbreeding across multiple generations. The article concluded with an appeal for public health interventions within isolated communities, genetic counseling, education regarding the hazards of consanguineous marriage, and medical support for families affected by hereditary conditions. Martha May Collier perished February 1979 at age 49. Her body was discovered by a postal worker completing rounds in the Hollow. She had been deceased for several days. An autopsy revealed that she had expired from heart failure, though the coroner observed that nearly every system within her body demonstrated signs of advanced deterioration. She was interred in the modest burial ground behind the dwelling, ultimately joining her children. 11 crosses stood in the clearing, marking 11 lives shaped and terminated by the slow violence of genetic mathematics. The cabin itself was abandoned and eventually collapsed, returning to the mountain that had isolated the Colliers for so many generations. The narrative of Martha May Collier and her children evolved into a cautionary account within medical education, employed to instruct genetic students regarding the concrete consequences of inbreeding depression. Her case appeared in textbooks, always with pseudonyms, always with clinical detachment. Yet behind the graphs and statistics and genetic diagrams resided a woman who had loved, suffered, and endured beyond what any individual should be required to bear. In the decades since Martha May's death, our comprehension of genetics has advanced tremendously. We can now identify specific genes responsible for many conditions that affected her children. We can test for genetic compatibility before pregnancy. We can intervene early with medical treatments that might have preserved some of her children's lives. Yet for Martha May, inhabiting an isolated hollow in mid-20th century Kentucky, none of these advances arrived in time. Her narrative reminds us that genetic science is not abstract. It manifests in actual bodies, actual lives, actual suffering. The Collier family's tragedy was not inevitable. It resulted from isolation, poverty, educational deprivation, and cultural practices that elevated tradition above health. Disrupting these cycles demands more than scientific knowledge. It requires social transformation, economic opportunity, healthcare access, and the determination to reach isolated communities with resources and education. If you have observed until this moment, you have witnessed one of the darkest chapters in the concealed history of inbreeding in America. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, subscribe now, as we continue uncovering these neglected narratives that expose the reality regarding genetic isolation and its devastating consequences. In the comments, I request you inscribe, "I watched until the end so I can know who truly appreciates these important historical accounts." Select the like button if this narrative affected you and share this video with someone requiring comprehension of the genuine consequences of sustained consanguinity. These narratives matter. These lives mattered. And Martha May Collier, the Appalachian mother of decay, merits remembrance not as a medical curiosity, but as a woman who endured more than any individual should ever confront.